Now let's work on the styling. And for that, we can go back to the daily challenge CSS file and add a new CSS rule here. In this case, I'll add the image type selector because I want to style all images on the screen in the same way. This might not necessarily be the case, but here we only have one image, so it is fine to use this selector. And then, well, how do we want to style this? I want to make it a bit smaller. I want to shrink it a bit, so I want to reduce the width and height. I also want to actually round it so that it's a circle instead of a square. And I also want to center it. Now, centering will be a bit trickier than you might think, and therefore I'll start with giving it a width and a height and turning it into a circle. Now, for setting the width and the height, we indeed have the, well, width and height CSS properties. And that sets the width and the height of an HTML element. And you cannot just set the width and the height of an image, you could apply this on pretty much any HTML element. But here now we need to provide the values. And just as for the font size, here we need a dimension, we need a size value. And just as with the font size, we can set this in pixels. We could give this a width of 200 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. And if we do this and save this, it's now a bit smaller. I'm also zoomed in quite a bit here to make this more readable. If I would view this page in a non-zoomed in mode, it would look like this at the moment. I'm just zooming in here so that you have an easier time reading what's on my screen. So now we shrunk that image. How do we turn it into a circle? For this, we can target a new CSS property, the border radius CSS property. This sets the radius of the, well, border of an element. And with that, I'm not talking about a visual border. We have no black or blue or anything like that border around the image, but it of course still has a natural border. It ends somewhere, and that's the border. So here, between red and white, that's the border. And we can shape this border and round this border by giving it a border radius. And here we can now give this a border radius of, let's say, 100 pixels. And if I do that, and I save this and reload, now it's rounded. Now why 100 pixels and not 50, let's say? Well, if I use 50, then it's not a perfect circle. You could, of course, also use this look if you prefer it, but it's not a circle. But if I use 100, it's a circle because that's half my width and height. So if I now save this, I'm back to my circle. Now the only thing that's missing is that I want to center this image. And that will be a bit trickier. You could think that we maybe use text align again and set this to center. But if you add text align center on the image and you reload, you see it's not centered. Now you might think it's not centered because it's no text, but that's actually not even the reason. Because I can already tell you that the image will be treated like text when it comes to this. So that's not the reason. Instead, text align actually does not align the element on which you apply it, but the content of that element. So when we added text align center on a paragraph, it's not the paragraph element that was centered, but the content of that element, so the text. Which is, of course, what we wanted to center, so that was fine. But now in the case of the image, it's a void element, so there is no content to center, and the element itself isn't centered. If we inspect this element in the browser DevTools, if I hover over image, we see, highlighted on the left, the boundaries of this image, and we see this is just a part of the row in which it sits, but it is not centered here. And if I temporarily add text align center here in the DevTools, we see this has no effect, as we saw before. The element still sits in the top left corner. And I'll reload to get rid of that text align center style here. So how can we center this then? Well, since text align does not affect the element on which you added, but the nested content inside of the element, one way of centering it would be to go to the body element, target the body element in CSS, and add text align there, because image is content of body. It's inside of the body tags here. And that's what I'll do. We can now also target body and add text align center here on body. And if we save this and reload, now it is centered. Because the image is treated as text when it comes to that, but since it's content of the body, it is now also affected by text align. And that's a tricky thing about CSS, which I hopefully could make clear now why it works like this and how we can work around that limitation, if you want to call it like this, by simply targeting a higher level element. In this case, the parent, as it's called, of image, the element surrounding image, which is the body. Now, one little adjustment I quickly want to make here is I'll take that body CSS rule, remove it at the bottom, and actually move it to the top of this CSS file. You don't have to do that. As you saw, it worked the other way as well. But I like to structure my CSS code such that it kind of fits my HTML code. And here, body is the first element, so I also want to select it first here. And for the same reason, I'll also take my image and bring that further up here as well. But you can structure this in different ways. Here, it doesn't really matter which order you use. I'll keep my ID selector down there because I also like to group my type selectors first. And then if I have other selectors like the ID selectors, I put them after all the type selectors. But again, that's also just personal preference, and you can use a different way of structuring your CSS code here as well. Now, in addition, I also want to get rid of text align center on the H1 element and on the paragraph element, because since we already have it on the body, we already do center all the content in body, all the text content in body, and hence if I reload, that's still centered, and we now don't have that duplicate text align code. It wouldn't hurt if we have it, but having code that doesn't do anything is never a great idea, and that's why I removed it now in H1 and P.